Charles. In today's new Tao of SK Wealth Academy podcast episode, today I am going to discuss the process and the great deception by which those in power have convinced us that the very worst in life is actually the very best that life has to offer, and how this process has become the normal thought processes of almost every single one you know. And I'm going to explain how this is. And when listening to this podcast, or after you've listened to this podcast episode, you can even test out my theory amongst all your friends, because I have tested this theory quite extensively over quite a long time span. And I have found that the majority of people that I meet, even longtime friends who I've never discussed this topic with before, but have discussed it in the past few years, I find that maybe the handful of people that really understand this great deception, I have discovered that there's only a handful of people out of thousands of people that I've met during my lifetime, including all my friends, that really agree with me about this great deception. So let me start by telling you the allegory of Plato's cave. I know probably many of you that are listening to this episode will already be familiar with Plato's cave, but I have found of all the strangers I discussed this with, no one's ever heard of Plato's cave, quite surprisingly. So I thought it'd be worthwhile just to briefly lay out what Plato's cave was. So Plato, as I'm sure all of you know, was this classical Greek philosopher, and he had this allegory in which he told a story about some men being imprisoned in a cave, and they were bound in such a manner in which they were forced to face the wall of a cave their entire lives, so they could not even turn around to see what was behind them. But behind them was a fire, and at nighttime shadows would be cast upon the cave wall by objects that moved in front of the fire. Now, since the prisoners could not see what was casting these shadows, they could only use their own imaginations as to what the reality was that was occurring behind them. So even when these prisoners gained their freedom and saw that their reality, which was just the perceptions of these shadows cast upon the cave wall, differed vastly from the reality that they now were able to see with their own eyes, since they had grown up their lives, their whole entire lives, just perceiving the reality, their perceptions were the reality. So this goes back to the statement that many people in positions of power said it's not important to control reality. It's only important to control people psychologically, to create a false reality within them, by which they confine themselves, by which they confine their own creativity, their own ability to achieve a lot in life, their own ability to believe and have faith in themselves. And this is what I think is happening in this world. And this is a very good allegory for modern day life, because I'm sure a lot of you have always heard that saying that of tabula rasa, right? The mind is a blank slate. So, give me a baby at birth and I can turn that baby into a racist, even if he has no racism in his genes, because I could bring that baby up to hate a person because of their skin color, because of their culture, because of their nationality. Because if that is the false perception you create within that baby's world, then that perception becomes reality, and it becomes normalized. That's the key. It becomes normalized. So we have to understand that we are all like this proverbial baby, although none of us really ever believe that we are. Trust me, we are. And I'm going to elucidate exactly what I mean in this podcast episode. So we can even begin by addressing Orwellian doublespeak that exists today, because there's so much doublespeak, even when it comes to just off the top of my head, let me think, cryptocurrencies, right? They always say cryptocurrencies are just from the word crypto, right? They're supposed to be secretive, right? So a lot of people thought the original or most popular cryptocurrency by market cap, like Bitcoin, they always thought it was anonymous. And I know people that are intelligent today intelligent today do not believe it's anonymous at all. But when it was first marketed in 2009, everyone I spoke to said that one of the benefits of using Bitcoin was that it was completely anonymous and untraceable. But really, they should call cryptocurrencies that record their transactions on the blockchain that exist forever. The record of that transaction exists forever. They should call them transparent currencies instead of cryptocurrencies, because there's a public record of every transaction on the internet forever, which makes every transaction trackable and traceable and taxable. So maybe you should call them trackable currencies instead of cryptocurrencies. Another, just the financial industry uses so much doublespeak. Another example would be like credit cards. Credit cards, yeah, you get credit so you can buy things, but they put you into debt. So they should really be called debt cards instead of credit cards. Currency, money, they call currency money, but currency is not the same as money, or it's not certainly not the same as sound money. You could call currency unsound money. But money really should be called loans, because there's an interest-bearing debt component to every single form of widely accepted money in the world today, which are just basically fiat currencies. So whether it's the euro, the yen, the yuan, the US dollar, Canadian dollar, Australian dollar, there's an interest-bearing debt component. So it should really be called debt as well, not really money, or at least a hybrid debt money instrument. But instead, we call it money instead of a loan, because in essence, it has an interest-bearing component that serves as debt and functions similarly to a loan. So back to that example of the baby I gave, that you could turn any baby into a racist, really, if you get it from birth and start teaching it to hate. But the reason I say we are all that baby as well, no matter what our age, is because most of us have never questioned certain paradigms into which we are born. So we think that is the best, when in fact they are the worst possible systems. We think the institutional academic system is the best educational system possible. We think that our current currency system and banking system is the best, monetary system available or possible, when in fact it is the worst monetary system possible that we could use, because it helps those that control the monetary supply in every nation and financially enslave all the other people of that nation. So, and I know this to be true because I've spoken to many bankers, because I used to be a private banker, used to work in private wealth management myself, although I left 15 years ago. And when I would speak to these bankers, I would say this is a terrible, horrible monetary system that we use today. And they would all say the same thing. There was not one that agreed with me. They would all say, well, it might not be perfect, but it's the best system we have, which is a ridiculous system, because if you really have studied monetary history, you know it is the worst possible system that we could use today. So that's why I say we all are like that baby, because we think that in essence, the worst systems are the best, because we simply don't know any better. We were born into that system, just like how you can train a baby to be racist. We are born into the systems, and we think abnormal is normal. And, like I said, we think that about the academic system. We think that about the financial systems. We even think about those in positions of authority today. We think, for example, most people would say, yeah, you should respect people in positions of authority, like teachers, like policemen, like prime ministers, like presidents. But why should they be respected? What makes them more apt to be moral and more apt to have integrity than the rest of the general population? There is nothing, because when you think about it, a lot of people in positions of authority, either they got it by bloodline, right, because they were born into very wealthy families, so the parents basically had a child, and just by having that child is born into a world of privilege and power. But there is nothing that would dictate that that person is going to become a moral person that should be a leader of society. And in fact, they're more likely probably to be less moral and less intelligent than the rest of society, because if you look at the history, the wealthiest people in the world, they would always inbreed with each other because they're so paranoid and they want to keep the power within their family that they would marry their first cousins, they would marry their brothers and sisters. And so that leads to genetic problems. And so they're actually less apt, but we believe they're more apt. And as far as those in positions of authority, like a teacher or a policeman, we should judge them by their actions, not just because they're in a position of authority should we ever trust them. So if the teacher turns out to promote critical thinking, to promote divergent thinking, to promote a diversity of opinion, so whatever topic is being discussed can reach the best conclusion, then pay that teacher respect. But if that teacher rules over students by authority and tells students that disagree with him or her to shut up and just obey what's written in the book, to obey her agenda and curricula, then that person is not deserving of respect. And the same goes to police, because, you know, even though I know my experiences have been skewed and I've run into a lot of racist cops, because a cop is not going to approach me probably unless they're racist if I haven't been doing anything wrong. So by that fact alone, the good cops, I'm a lot less likely to encounter with good, solid cops that do their job and to help out the community, which I know is the majority of police, and that there's a minority of really bad cops. But then again, we should not respect that minority of bad cops. We should do everything in our power to ensure that they go to jail, they're arrested for their crimes, or if they're just racist and aggressively abusive of people that they're racist towards, then we should ensure that they lose their job. We shouldn't just equally respect all cops. We should respect those that do their job well and not respect those that abuse their power. So these are the type of questions that I really want people to think about very deeply in this podcast episode. And in fact, I think if you are a parent with a very young child, say under 3 years of age, then there is a wonderful opportunity for you to learn from your child. Because I think whether or not you send your child to institutional academics, that there's a certain amount of homeschooling that everyone should engage in with their children, and that is to encourage them to think critically, especially if they're like 3 or 4 years old. And by doing so, I guarantee that your children are going to ask a lot of questions about the certain paradigms that they were born into that we never asked when we were young. So they will ask, just because everyone goes to school in my neighborhood, you know, at this particular high school, this particular middle school, this particular elementary school, or this particular preschool, they will start asking, is this really the best form of education? Or what do you consider to be education? What do you consider to be intelligence? What do you consider should be the purpose of education? And they will start asking questions even about money. They will start asking, why can I buy 100 times more goods with the same piece of paper that just has a different number on it? One has 100 and the other has a 1. It seems to me like the exact same piece of paper. So how does this monetary system work? And why does it give us the ability, just because of a change of a number in the corner of the exact same piece of paper and maybe a picture of a different queen or a president on it, does it give us this ability? So how does the modern monetary system really work? Does it serve human beings, or does it serve the people that actually control the banking system? They will start asking these questions, and it will make you realize as a parent, you know what, I never asked these questions when I was younger, and I've gone through my whole life, and now it may be 25 years old, 35 years old, 45 years old, maybe even older if it's your grandchildren, maybe even 60 years old, and have never asked these questions, that now your children or grandchildren who are only 4, 5, 6 years old will start asking, and they'll be able for you, they'll be able actually to shed a different perspective on life and be able to perhaps get you to understand that you have been in that prisoner in Plato's cave that has been staring at the shadows on the cave wall your entire life and believing those shadows were reality, when in fact those shadows were just perceptions created by those in power in order to limit our potential, in order to beat us down and control us, in order to crush our dreams and not make us believe in ourselves. And so, this is something that's been repeated time and time again by those in positions of power. Hank Paulson, who was like the CEO of Goldman Sachs, and then he became the U.S. Treasury Secretary during the 2008 financial crisis, said, the U.S. stock market does not operate on reality. And I could say that for a fact, because you look at a lot of the stocks that have gone up like rockets, no pun intended, when you look at Elon Musk's Tesla. A lot of people don't know Tesla was founded 17 years ago, but has never declared one dime of profit in 17 years. What is that? 17 times 4, 68 financial quarters. So what is that based upon if it's not based upon profitability, if it's not based upon reality? So this is just, it's insane. And you can find a lot of stocks that make up, that really drive the S&P 500 in that same boat as Tesla. And that's why Hank Paulson said it's not important that banks are sound. It's not important that the stock market is sound. He said that is reality. He's like, it's only important what people believe. So even if we have the most unsound, fragile, ready to collapse stock markets and banks, as long as people believe they're sound, they can still keep operating even if they're bankrupt. It doesn't matter. You make up fake financials, you show them to the world, people believe what they read in the mass media because they trust the mainstream media, and this will keep stock markets afloat. This will make them recover. This will keep banks afloat, even though there's a lot of big global banks, I'm telling you, are bankrupt if they were marketing their assets to market value, but they have their own internal valuation models that are totally just a bunch of rubbish and garbage that make them appear to be financially robust. So in the end, with all this talk about virtual reality, it does not even matter, because we've heard people like Elon Musk say that it's 1,000,000,000 to 1 we are living in a computer simulation right now. And so that means he believes, I don't know if he was just saying that to garner attention for himself and Tesla, or if he really believes that. But if he really believes that, he's basically saying there's virtually zero chance we're not living in a computer simulation. But this whole talk about virtual reality, people don't realize, because he was saying in perhaps 10 years, or maybe he said 20 years, I don't exactly remember the dateline he gave, but he said in very short time, not too far in the distant future, that virtual reality is going to become indistinguishable. It's going to progress at such a rapid rate, because we've seen the rapid rate it's progressed in the last 10 years, that we are not going to be able to, once inside the virtual reality world, besides knowing that we have entered it, once we're inside it, he said we're not going to be able to distinguish that from the real world. But all this talk about how real virtual reality is going to seem to us is really irrelevant, because most of us are living in a virtual world today that's not real, because most of us are controlled by our perceptions, and our perceptions are absolutely wrong about the real world. And the problem we have is that it's very hard for all of us to really escape our false perceptions of this world. Because when you stand outside, because very few people really understand the allegory of Plato's cave, and very few people in this world truly understand that that is 100% applicable to how we perceive the world to be today. So when you're standing outside as maybe not a second outlier, a third outlier, a fourth outlier, but you're standing as a fifth outlier way outside that bell curve, everyone else is going to say you are crazy when you reveal reality and truth to them. Because psychological studies have shown that people want to belong to the herd. They don't want to stand out. So they feel uncomfortable, in fact, being that outlier of the bell curve, and they will go gravitate towards the middle and the medius portion of the bell curve. And how we've seen that, we've seen psychological studies. I remember reading about psychological study in which, when you enter an elevator, it's normal for you to turn around and face the elevator doors. But they would do these studies in which they put these test subjects all facing away from the elevator door. So the person that walked in, although they initially turned and faced the elevator door, they felt so uncomfortable going against the crowd that they eventually turned around. And I can't remember what the rate it was off the top of my head, but I think it was well over 90% of the test subjects conformed to the wrong direction the people were facing, right? Because they're not facing the exit when the elevator doors open. They're facing either a mirror or the solid wall that's opposite the elevator doors. And they said well over 90% of test subjects, I believe, conformed and would turn around. So when we discuss the fact that much of what we believe is a perception, it's very hard to awaken people. So that's why I say this podcast episode probably has the most value to parents with very young children, or the grandparents of very young children. Because if you teach them the Plato's Cave allegory now, and you teach them to question everything about the paradox, not just accept it as this is the best way to live your life, this is the best money we can use, this is the best career path for you, this is the best educational path for you. But if they question everything and say, you know what, maybe 99.9% of society is doing this, but I don't feel it's right for me, I don't feel it's the best path for me, then by nature, you're going to create the most enlightened child in society. Probably not only in your entire community, maybe even in your entire city, or maybe even in your entire country. A second allegory that I think is truly relevant to today's world is the story of Siddhartha. Now, Siddhartha was a wealthy Indian prince who was said to found Buddhism. But as a child, he grew up inside a walled city within 3 palaces, and he was never allowed to experience what the rest of India would believe to be commonplace, or would consider as commonplace. So he wasn't permitted to see any old people, any sick people, or even death. So inside his walled city and palaces, he never saw suffering. He never saw any type of need in life. And that, if you grow up your entire life that way, then you would think that's normal. You would think that's the way everybody lives. And even when he ventured outside, he was eventually allowed to venture outside because he became increasingly curious of what lied outside these palaces in which he was not allowed to leave as a child. His father, the king, only arranged that young, beautiful, healthy people should greet him. So his outside view was also warped. But one day, when he was being led through the capital, they said he accidentally encountered some old men. And never having seen any elderly men, he was really confused, and he chased after them to find out what they were. He didn't even understand growing old. He didn't understand death. And then he saw some sick people. He didn't understand that either, because he was always surrounded by young, healthy, beautiful people. And on the opposite side are the people that lived outside of his palace. And they would see suffering all the time because they didn't have the type of wealth and riches he had. And if they had been let inside those walls, then they would be confused too by, wow, nobody suffers inside these walls. No one ever has need of medicine, of food and shelter. And that type of completely polar opposite world would confuse them. So I contend that using the story of Siddhartha, as another analogy for modern day life, that those in power live inside the same walled cities and palaces as Siddhartha, but we are prevented from entering it. So our normality of the systems of education, banking, government, religion, we're all living outside the city walls, and we think that is what is best, because we are not allowed to see inside those city walls of what the best systems really are, and that's where they lie. So that's why it's so easy to control us, and that's why it's so easy for people, or so difficult, I mean, for people to really think big, because I'm telling you, so many of my friends, when I lived outside of America for the first time, I went to live in Japan. People said, well, aren't you scared? Do you speak Japanese? How are you going to get around? You're all alone. You don't have any friends in Japan. That's just totally crazy. Some people said that was crazy just to live in another country. That's how confined they have us within these perceptions they created for us. And then when I came back and lived in the States, and then I left to go live in Asia again, people said the same thing. I don't think I could ever leave the United States. And my response would be, why? Why is it so difficult to break out of this whole nationalistic fervor and think that the country in which you were born is the best possible home for you of the entire world, out of a nation, I mean, out of a world of 194 nations, and every person believes that. If you were born in Mexico, you think Mexico is the best place in the world. If you were born in the US, you think the US is the best place in the world. If you're born in Canada, you think Canada is the best place in the world. And I know, like, I'm being very general, because if you're born into poverty in Mexico, born into poverty in the Dominican Republic, then you may want to obviously leave and find somewhere that has more economic opportunity. But still, there's a bit of you that remains very prideful of your country. And think about why that is. Why aren't we just seeking what is best for our families, the best possible living conditions that give the best possible opportunities to our families, our friends, our children if you have children, our grandchildren if you have grandchildren, because that is really the way that we should be thinking. And then I would have to have the same conversations when I decide to start my own business. People said, oh, you're crazy. Because look at the career path you're on. If you just stay on this career path, you're set for life. Why would you abandon that? Why would you give it up? Why would you even think of doing anything else? Why would you think of risking all? What if it doesn't work? What if all your money's gone? What are you going to do? And that's just, to me, that's a crazy way to think. Whereas they would see how my thought process and my thinking as crazy. And I would say, well, for the freedom it gives you to run your own business. That is what I want out of life, because you only have one life. I want to make it the best possible life for myself. And if that involves great risk, so be it. Then I'll have to take risks, because even staying within the corporate world is a risk. You don't know the downturns that are going to happen in your industry. You don't know the downsizing that could happen in the future. You don't know that the fact that you'll be on board forever, because corporations have no loyalty but to money and to profits. So you could be laid off in the future. There's no guarantees in life. So for me, to start my own business, I didn't see that as any greater risk than staying in the industry. And then I see that whole abnormality versus normality opposition paradigm that those in power have built for us when I left banking. Because, I left because I didn't see it as a moral industry. I didn't see it as an industry that contributed to humanity. And even when I told the bankers, look, even one of you very young, Paul Volcker, who was the head of the U.S. Federal Reserve for a time and also a former U.S. Treasury Secretary, he even stated very recently, just a few years ago, I believe it was in Davos, Switzerland, at a banker meeting of all these global bankers. He said, the only thing, the positive social contribution the banking industry and any banker has made to society in the past 25 years is the ATM machine. Because he said, at least that saved us the convenience of having to go to the bank to withdraw cash. And he said that's the only positive social contribution. He said everything else the banking industry has done has been a net negative contribution to society. So even when I told my fellow bankers this, that one of your own has even said, one of the most powerful bankers in the entire world has even agreed with me about the net negative social contribution of banking and the reason I'm leaving banking. Because they had been in banking so long, they would see all the bad things bankers do to people, throwing them out of their houses after giving them mortgages they know they can't afford, because the bottom line is making money. So, people don't even know that interest payments on mortgages can be stripped from the underlying mortgage itself, and then they can be pooled in these type of mortgage derivative pull products, and then even sold outside of the country because they know they're bad. Why are they selling them to Australian banks? I think the NAB, what is that? The National Australian Bank? I can't remember. That's what it stands for. Got duped, and they were sold a lot of these bad mortgages by U.S. bankers. So if you see this type of behavior being repeated over and over again, you begin to think that it is normal. I'm telling you, you're so immersed in it, you don't see it as wrong. You see it as normal, because when I tried to convince some of my fellow bankers I cared about to leave the industry, they would tell me they see nothing wrong with the industry because they have been so immersed. That was normal, and my position of being able to clearly see reality was abnormal. So let me know what you think. Do you believe in Plato's Cave allegory? If you have kids, are you going to teach your kid about Plato's Cave? You can look it up on the internet. Again, don't use Google because I hate Google. Use DuckDuckGo.com or StartPage.com, because, this is how much I hate Google. Because even I'm going to get like a burner phone that has like nothing on it, like no applications or anything. Because even when I turn the applications off, Google turns them back on. I'm telling you, even when I say not to update, and I go to the Google Play app that is automatically, just uploaded on every smartphone today, and I change the settings, do not update applications. I see sometimes the applications being updated on my phone, and then I go check, and somehow it's been mysteriously turned on. And then even when I delete some apps, they come back on my phone because they're Google apps. Google is just insanity. So I hope you guys don't stop using the Google search engine and start using startpage.com or duckduckgo.com. And tell me whether you plan, if you have young children, to teach your kids about Plato's Cave, because I certainly didn't learn about it in school. I had to learn it outside of school. And that's why I say your best education is going to come outside of the classroom. And let me know if you're going to teach them about the story of Siddhartha. Or, I don't know, Tolstoy has some great short stories too. If I can remember off the top of my head, some really good stories that teach critical thinking. And I will put it in the show notes again. So please do comment below. Let me know what you think of my thoughts. Do you agree? You disagree? And the most you can do for me to help me out, if you enjoyed this podcast, if it made you think, is to spread it to as many people as possible. Spread it to all your friends, spread it to your family, spread it to your colleagues. Tell them to go listen to this. Again, it's going to be on iTunes too, so it can be downloaded on your iPod, your iPad for later listening, on your earbuds while you're going to work, or you could be doing something else while listening to this podcast as well. So it's going to be available on Burberry and on iTunes, and I'll put the links below as well. Thanks a lot for listening. I really hope everyone has a beautiful, beautiful day if you're listening to this during the day, or a beautiful evening if you're listening to this at night. And always, always remember to remain intensely curious. So long.